Hey guys, so if we were at school today, we would be starting to read The People of Sparks, which is a sequel to The City of Ember. So, wanted to go ahead and keep the read aloud strong. I have our friend Jupiter here who wants to listen in also. So, The People of Sparks, the second book of Ember, written by Jean Duprow. Here we go. It starts off reminding us what the message was that Lena and Dune sent down at the end of City of Ember. Dear people of Ember, we came down the river from the pipeworks and found the way to another place. It is green here and very big. Light comes from the sky. You must follow the instructions in this message and come on the river. Bring food with you. Come as quickly as you can. Lena Mayfleet and Dune Harrow. Part 1, Arrival. Chapter 1, What Torin Saw. Torin was out at the edge of the cabbage field that day, the day the people came. He was supposed to be fetching a couple of cabbages from Dr. Hester to use in the soup that night, but as usual, he didn't see why he shouldn't have some fun while he was out there. So he climbed up the wind tower, which he wasn't supposed to do, because they said he might fall or get his head sliced off by the big blades going around and around. The wind tower was four-sided, made of boards nailed one above the next, like the rungs of a ladder. Torin climbed the back side of it, the side that faced the hills and not the village, so that the little group of workers hoeing the cabbage fields wouldn't see him. At the top, he turned around and sat on the flat place behind the blades, which turned slowly in the idle summer breeze. He had brought a pocketful of small stones up with him, planning on some target practice. He liked to try to hit the chickens that rummaged around between the rows of cabbages. He thought it might be fun to bounce a few pebbles off the hats of the workers, too. But before he had ever taken the stones from his pocket, he caught sight of something that made him stop and stare. Out beyond the cabbage field was another field where young tomato and corn and squash plants were growing, and beyond that the land sloped up into a grassy hillside dotted, at this time of year, with yellow mustard flowers. Torin saw something strange at the top of the hill, something dark. There were bits of darkness at first. For a second he thought maybe it was a deer, or several deer, black ones instead of the usually light brown. But the shape was wrong for deer, and the way these things moved was wrong too. He realized very soon that he was seeing people. A few people at first, and then more and more of them. They came up from the other side of the hill and gathered at the top and stood there, a long line of them against the sky, like a row of black teeth. There must have been 100, Torin thought, or more than 100. In all of his life, Torin had never seen more than 3 or 4 people at a time arriving at the village from elsewhere. Almost always, the people who came were roamers, passing through with a truckload of stuff from the old towns to sell. This massing of people on the hilltop terrified him. For a moment he couldn't move. Then his heart started up a furious pounding, and he scrambled down off the wind tower so fast that he scraped his hands on the rough boards. "Someone's coming!" he shouted as he passed the workers. They looked up, startled. Torin ran at full speed toward the low cluster of brown buildings at the far end of the field. He turned up a dirt lane, his feet raising swirls of dust, and dashed through the gate in the wall and across the courtyard, and in through the open door, all the time yelling, "Someone's coming! Up on the hill, Auntie Hester! Someone's coming!" He found his aunt in the kitchen, and he grabbed her by the waist of her pants and cried, "Come and see! There's people on the hill!" His voice was so shrill and urgent and loud that his aunt dropped the spoon into the pot of soup she had been stirring and hurried after him. By the time they got outside, others from the village were leaving their houses too and looking toward the hillside. The people were coming down. Over the crest of the hill they came and kept coming, dozens of them, more and more like a mudslide. The people of the village crowded into the streets. "Get Mary Waters!" someone called. "Where's Ben and Wilmer? Find them! Tell them to get out here!" Torn was less frightened now that he was surrounded by the townspeople. "I saw them first," he said to Hattie Carranza, who happened to be hurrying alongside next to him. "I was the one who told the news." "Is that right?" said Hattie. We won't let them do anything bad to us, said Torin. If they do, we'll do something worse to them, won't we? But she just glanced down at him with a vague frown and didn't answer. The three village leaders, Mary Waters, Ben Barlow, and Wilmer Dent, had joined the crowd by now and were leading the way across the cabbage field. Torin kept close behind them. The strangers were getting nearer, and he wanted to hear what they would say. He could see that they were terrible looking people. Their clothes were all rawn, coats and sweaters, although the weather was warm, and not nice coats and sweaters, but raggedy ones, patched, unraveling, faded, grimy. They carried bundles, all of them, sacks of what looked like tablecloths or blankets gathered up and tied with string around the neck. They moved clumsily and slowly. Some of them even tripped on the ground and had to be helped up by others. In the center of the field, where the smell of new cabbages and fresh dirt and chicken manure were strong, those at the front of the crowd of strangers met the village leaders. Mary Waters stepped to the front, and the villagers crowded up behind her. Torin, being small, wriggled between people until he had a good view. He stared at the ragged people. Who were their leaders? Facing Mary was a girl and a boy who looked only a little older than himself. Next to them was a bald man, and next to him a sharp-eyed woman holding a small child. Maybe she was the leader. But when Mary stepped forward and said, "Who are you?" it was the boy who answered. He spoke in a clear, loud voice that surprised Torin, who had expected a pitiful voice from someone so bedraggled. "We come from the city of Ember," the boy said. "We left there because our city was dying. We need help." Mary, Ben, and Wilmer exchanged glances. Mary frowned. "The city of Ember? Where's that? We've never heard of it." The boy gestured back the way they had come, to the east. "That way," he said. "It's underground." The frowns deepened. "Tell us the truth," said Ben, "not childish nonsense." This time it was the girl who spoke up. She had long, snarled hair with bits of grass caught in it. "It isn't a lie. Really, our city is underground. We didn't know it until we came out." Ben snorted impatiently, folding his arms across his chest. "Who is in charge here?" He looked at the bald man. "Is it you?" The bald man shook his head and gestured toward the boy and the girl. "They're as in charge as anyone," he said. "The mayor of our city is no longer with us. These young people are speaking the truth. We have come out of a city built underground." The people around him all nodded and murmured, "Yes, it's true." "My name is Dune Harrow," said the boy, "and this is Lena Mayfleet. We found the way out of Ember." He thinks he's pretty great, thought Torin, hearing a note of pride in the boy's voice. He didn't look so great. His hair was shaggy, and he was wearing an old jacket that was coming apart at the seams and grimy at the cuffs, but his eyes shone out confidently from under his dark eyebrows. "We're hungry," the boy said, "and thirsty. Will you help us?" Mary, Ben, and Wilmer stood silent for a moment. Then Mary took Ben and Wilmer by the arms and led them aside a few steps. They whispered to each other, glanced up at the great swarm of strangers, frowned, whispered some more. While he waited to hear what they'd say, Torin studied the ground. It might be true. They did in fact look as if they had crawled out of a hole. Most of them were scrawny and pale, like the sprouts you see when you lift up a board that's been lying on the ground, feeble things that have tried to grow in the dark. They huddled together looking frightened. They looked exhausted, too. Many of them had sat down on the ground now, and some had their heads in the laps of others. The three village leaders turned again to the crowd of strangers. "How many of you are there?" Mary Waters asked. "About 400, said the boy Dune. Mary's dark eyebrows jumped. 400! In Torin's whole village there was only 322. He swept his gaze out over this vast horde. They filled half the cabbage field and were still coming over the hill like ants. Torin snickered. The girl with the rowdy hair stepped forward and raised a hand, as if she were in school. "Excuse me, Madam Mayor," she said. Madam Mayor? Nobody called Mary Waters Madam Mayor. They just called her Mary. "Madam Mayor," said the girl, "my little sister is very sick." She pointed to the baby being held by the sharp-eyed woman. It did look sick. Its eyes were half closed and its mouth hung open. "Some others of us are sick too," the girl went on, "or hurt. Lottie Hoover tripped and hurt her ankle, and Nammy Proggs is exhausted from walking so far. She's nearly 80 years old. Is there a doctor in your town?" Is there a place where sick people can go lie down and be taken care of? Mary turned to Ben and Wilmer again, and they spoke to each other in low voices. Torrin could catch only a few words of what they said. Too many. But human kindness. Maybe just take a few of them? Ben rubbed his beard and scowled. Wilmer kept glancing at the sick baby. After a few minutes, they nodded to each other. Mary said, "All right, hoist me up." Ben and Wilmer bent down and grasped Mary's legs. With a grunt, they lifted her so she was high enough to see over the crowd. She raised both of her arms and cried in a voice that came from the depths of her deep chest, "People from Ember, welcome. We will do what we can to help you. Please follow us." Ben and Wilmer set her down, and the three of them turned and walked out of the cabbage field and toward the road that entered the village. Led by the boy and the girl, the crowd of shabby people followed. Torrin dashed ahead, ran down the lane, and got up onto the low wall that bordered his house. From there, he watched the people from underground go by. They were strangely silent. Why weren't they jabbering to each other? They stared at everything, wide-eyed and drop-jawed, as if they had never seen a house before, or a tree, or a chicken. In fact, the chickens seemed to frighten them. They shrank back when they saw them, making startled sounds. It took a long time for the whole raggedy crowd to pass Torrin's house, and when the last people had gone by, he jumped down off the wall and followed them. They were being led, he knew, to the town center, down by the river, where there would be a water for them to drink. After that, what would happen? What would they eat? Where would they sleep? Not in my room, he thought. Chapter 2, Out from Below. The people from the dying city of Ember had come up into the new world only a few days before. The first to arrive had been Lena Mayfleet and Dune Harrow, bringing Lena's little sister, Poppy, with them. From a ledge high up in the great cave that held their city, they'd thrown down a message, hoping someone would find it and lead the others out. Then they waited. At first they explored the wonders around them, but as the hours passed, they began to worry that their message wouldn't be found and that they would be alone in this world forever. Then, in the late afternoon of the next day, Dune suddenly shouted, "Look! They're coming!" Lena grabbed Poppy by the hand. All three of them ran toward the mouth of the cave. Who was it? Who was it coming home? A woman emerged from the darkness first, and then two men, and then three children, all of them squinting against the bright light. "Hello, hello!" Lena called, leaping up the hill. She saw who it was when she got closer, the family who ran the Calais Street vegetable market. She didn't know any of them very well. She couldn't even remember their names, but she was so glad to see them that tears sprang to her eyes. She flung her arms around each one in turn, crying, "Here you are! Look, isn't it wonderful? Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Are more coming?" The new arrivals were too breathless and amazed to answer, but it didn't matter, because Lena could see for herself. They came out from the cave, shading their eyes with their hands. They came in bunches, a few of them, and then minutes later a few more, stumbling out into a light 1,000 times brighter than they'd ever seen. They stared in astonishment, walked a few steps, and then just stood there, dropping the sacks and bundles they carried, gazing, blinking. To Lena and Dune, who felt already that they belonged here, the refugees from Ember looked strange in this bright landscape of green grass and blue sky. They were so drab and dingy in their heavy, mud-colored clothes, their coats and sweaters in colors like stone and dust and murky water. It was as if they had brought some of Ember's darkness with them. Dune suddenly leapt away, shouting, "Father! Father!" He threw himself against his stunned father, who fell backward, sat down on the ground, and burst into a combination of laughter and weeping to see his son again. "You are here," he gasped. "I wasn't sure. I didn't know." All afternoon they came. Lizzie Biscoe came and others from the old high class, along with Clary Lane from the greenhouses, and the doctor who had helped Lena's granny, and Sage Merrill, who had tried to go out into the unknown regions. Mrs. Murdo came walking in her brisk, business-like way, but giving a cry of joy when she saw Lena hurtling toward her. People came whose faces Lena recognized, but whose names she didn't remember, like the shoe repair man from Livery Street, and the little puffy-faced woman who lived in Silverton Square, and the tall black-haired boy with blue-gray eyes so light they looked like metal. What was that tall boy's name? She spent a second trying to recall it, but only a second. It didn't matter. These were her people, the people of Ember. All of them were tired and all of them were thirsty. Lena showed them the little stream, and they splashed the water on their faces and filled their bottles there. "What about the mayor?" Lena asked Mrs. Murdo, but she just shook her head. "He's not with us," she said. Some of the older people looked terrified to be in such a huge place, a place that seemed to go on without borders in all directions. After they had stared nervously about them for a while, they sat down in the grass, hunched over, and put their heads to their knees. But the children ran around in ecstasy, touching everything, smelling the air, splashing their feet in the stream. By evening, 417 people had arrived. Dune was keeping track. As the light began to fade through the sky, they shared the food they had brought, and then, using their coats as blankets and their bundles as pillows, they lay down on the warm, rough ground and slept. The next morning they got ready to leave. Lena and Dune, when they first arrived, had spotted a narrow gray line that ran along the ground like a pencil stroke in the distance. They thought it might be a road. So the people of Ember, having no other clue about where to go, picked up their bundles and set out in that direction, a long, straggling line trailing across the hills. It was on this walk that Mrs. Murdo told Lena and Dune about leaving Ember. The three then walked together, Mrs. Murdo with Poppy in her arms. Dune's father walked behind him, leaning forward now, wanting to hear what Mrs. Murdo was saying. "I was the one who found your message," Mrs. Murdo said. "It fell right at my feet. It was the day after the singing. I was on my way home from the market, worried, was sick because you and Poppy had disappeared. Then there was your message." She paused and looked at the sky. She was keeping a couple of tears from falling, Lena saw. Mrs. Murdo composed herself and went on. "I thought it would be best to tell the mayor first. I wasn't sure I trusted him, but he was the one who could most easily organize everyone leaving. I showed him your message, and then I waited to hear the city clock ringing out the signal for a meeting." Mrs. Murdo paused to catch her breath. They were going uphill, over some rough clumps of earth, hard walking for city people whose feet are accustomed to pavement. "Was there a meeting?" Lena asked. "No," said Mrs. Murdo. She plucked some burrs off her skirt and shifted Poppy to the other shoulder. "Mercy," she said, "it's terribly hot here." She stood still for a moment, breathing hard. "So there was no meeting?" Lena prompted. Mrs. Murdo started walking again. "Nothing happened at all," she said. "The clock didn't chime. The guards didn't come out and start organizing people. Nothing. But the lights kept flickering on and off. It seemed to be there was no time to lose. So I went to the pipeworks and showed your message to Lister Monk. We followed the directions, and we found the rock marked with E right away, because people were already there." "But how could that be if they didn't have the directions?" Dune said. "Who was it?" "It was the mayor," said Mrs. Murdo grimly, "and 4 of his guards. Looper was there too, that boy who used to keep company with your friend Lizzie. They had huge bulging sacks with them piled up on the edge of the river, and they were loading the sacks into the boats. The mayor was shouting at them to work faster. Lister yelled, 'What are you doing?' But we didn't need an answer. I could see what he was doing. They were trying to go first. The mayor was making sure that he would get out with his friend and his loot before anybody else." Mrs. Murdo stopped talking. She trudged along, wiping sweat from her forehead. She frowned up at the hot, bright sky. Poppy whimpered. "Let me carry the child for a while, Mrs. Murdo," said Dune's father. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Murdo said. She stopped and passed the squirming Poppy to Dune's father, and they walked on. Lena waited a minute or so, and then she couldn't wait any longer. "Well, what happened?" she said. "It was awful," Mrs. Murdo said. "Everything happened at once. 2 of the guards looked up at us and lost their balance, and they fell into the water. They grabbed hold of the loaded boats, which made the boats tip over and dump their load into the river. The other guards and Looper knelt down and tried to reach him, but they were pulled in too. In the midst of it all, the mayor jumped onto the one boat that was still upright, but as soon as he hit it, it turned over and plunged into the river." Mrs. Murdo shuddered. "He screamed, children. It was a horrible sound. He bobbed in the water like a giant cork, and then he went under. In just a few seconds, him and the guards were swept away, and they were gone." They walked in silence for a while, going downhill now. After a few minutes, Mrs. Murdo went on. "So Lister and I went back up into the city, and we had the timekeeper ring the bell for a public meeting. We tried to explain what to do, but as soon as people heard the first bit, that there was a way out of Ember, and that it was in the pipeworks, everyone began shouting and rushing around. Things turned into a horrible mess. People were in too much of a hurry to even ask questions. Hundreds of them poured through the streets of the city all at once, and outside the door of the pipeworks, a huge crowd pushed and shoved. So many people, so panicky, some were trampled and crushed. Oh, cried Lena, how horrible! These were people she knew. It was awful just to think about. Horrible indeed, said Mrs. Murdo. She frowned out across the vast landscape surrounding them, where there was no people in sight at all. It was impossible to control them, she went on. They rushed to the stairway. Some people lost their footing and fell all the way down the stairs. Others ran right over them. And then when they realized that they were going to have to get into those little shells and float on the river, some people were so frightened that they turned around, tried to go up the stairs again, and some were so eager to get going that they jumped into the boats, capsizing them, falling into the river, and drowning. She raised her eyes to Lena's. I saw everything that happened. I'll never forget it. Lena looked behind her at the citizens of Ember toiling across the hills. Those were the ones who had made it out. How many do you think were left behind? She asked Mrs. Murdo. Mrs. Murdo just shook her head. I don't know. Too many. And have the lights gone out forever now? I don't know that either, but if they haven't, they will soon. Hot as she was, Lena shuddered. She and Dune exchanged a look. They were thinking the same thing, she was sure. Their city was lost in darkness now, and anyone left there was lost too. Later that day, the refugees from Ember came to the road they had seen from afar. It was potholed and weed-cracked, but easier to walk on than the rough ground. It led alongside a creek that flowed swiftly over round, smooth rocks. In all directions they saw nothing but endless expanses of grass. They shared the food they had brought with them. But it wasn't much. Soon, some of them were too weak with hunger to go on. They grew faint from the heat, too, which was hard to bear for people used to the constant chill of Ember. Poppy cried when she was set down on her feet, and her face looked flushed and hot. Night came in a strange, gradual way, so different from the sudden lights out that signaled nighttime in Ember. The travelers lay down on the ground and slept. They walked the next day, too, and the day after that. By then the food they had brought with them was gone. They traveled more and more slowly, stopping often to rest. Poppy was listless. Her eyes were dull. Finally, around the middle of the following day, they trudged up still another hill, and from there they saw a sight that made many of them cry with relief. Farmed fields lay below them in a wide valley, and beyond the fields were the stream they had been following, joined by a river. There was a cluster of low brown buildings. It looked like a place where people lived. Like the others, Lena was glad to see it, but it wasn't a bit like the city she had imagined, the one she had drawn pictures of back in Ember, the one that she had hoped to find in this new world. The buildings of that city had been tall and majestic and sparkling with light. That city must be somewhere else, she thought as she started down the hill. She would find it. Not today, but someday. So that is the first 2 chapters of The People of Sparks. I will keep reading as the days go on. So the first chapter was all about the city of Ember, the people coming across into this new world, this new town that they just found, but we're hearing from the people of Sparks kind of what that would look like for them to see all these underground people coming up to try to live with them. And then the second chapter, all about how the people of Ember, the city of Ember, they were able to make their way out, and what does that look like for them. So Jupiter and I say that we hope you have an amazing Monday, and I will read the next 2 chapters tomorrow. So bye everyone.